Salem Witch Trials of 1692, presented by Roberto, Michael, McLean, and Vanessa. I will begin by breaking down our topic into four major points. Number 1, the history of the town. What people thought of witchcraft. 2, go into more detail of the Salem Witch Trials. Who started it and why? What did people of Salem think about the trials? What happened to those accused? Number 3, the individual stories. 4, the aftermath of the Salem Witch Trials. What happened to the town? What happened to the people? Did everything return to normal life? Did people move on? I will begin the presentation with a quote from William Barker Sr. Satan's design was to set up his own worship, abolish all the churches in the land, to fall next on Salem, and so go through the country. In other words, what so-called Satan wanted people to fear it and make people want to believe it. Because people were so religious back then, they believed anything that didn't seem normal. They believed some things such as girls being possessed and seeing demons. People felt scared and not safe during the time.
Established in 1626, the town of Salem, Massachusetts was a thriving farming and fishing community. The people in this colonial town lived a simple life of hard work and Puritan faith. But in 1692, religious fervor turns into fear. It all begins in the home of Salem's esteemed church leader, Samuel Parris.
The first afflictions happened in Reverend Parris's household. Parris's daughter Betty and his niece Abigail Williams began acting strange. They had convulsions.
These girls were under a malady which scared the hell out of a lot of the adults. The girls would contort into all sorts of contortions that just weren't normal. They would often run towards the fireplace as if to burn themselves up. In some cases, it's reported that bite marks occurred on their bodies, and they were really sick.
The family used home remedies. They called in doctors, physicians, and they prayed for them.
The girls' afflictions were so scary, were so true, that they didn't believe these were normal, these were natural. These had to be supernatural.
Finally, one of the doctors said they must be under an evil hand, which means a curse, witchcraft.
The persecution of witchcraft was fairly new in America compared to other countries such as France, Italy, Germany, and England, where massive witch hunts have been going on for more than 300 years. Between the 14th and 16th centuries, an estimation of 50,000 people were executed for the practicing of witchcraft. There were also religious factors that contributed to the Salem witch trials. Many of those who were very religious had a strong belief that the devil could give people known as witches the power to harm others. The Salem witch trials began in what is known as Salem, Massachusetts, or present-day Danvers, Massachusetts. Salem was founded in 1626 by Roger Conant and a group of planters. Roger Conant was born in England and dedicated his work as a salter. Later, he and his family migrated to the Plymouth colony in 1624. During the time, Salem began to attract large numbers of English immigrants. The Salem witch trials were a dark time in history where people accused others of witchcraft. There was no trust between anyone and everyone felt targeted. Those who believed in the trials lived with paranoia, and those who didn't believe were still scared for their families. They had people falsely accused, from young children to old adults. By the end of the witch trials, more than 200 people were accused of practicing witchcraft and resulted in more than 19 executions.
Early in 1692, several young girls began to writhe and roar. They complained of bites and pinches. They alternately interrupted sermons and fell mute. Their throats choked, their limbs racked, an observer had noted. After some hesitation, after much discussion, they were declared to be bewitched. Tituba, the Paris's Caribbean slave, Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly, impoverished woman, were all accused of bewitching them. Tituba confessed, "The devil came to me and bid me serve him." She described elaborate images of black dogs, red cats, yellow birds, and a black man who wanted her to sign his book. She admitted that she signed the book and said there were several other witches looking to destroy the Puritans. She had also stated that there were indeed other witches in Salem. All three women were put in jail. When all of this had happened, that's when the village panicked and began a witch hunt which lasted a year. This is the famously known Salem witch trials. Opinions of the people. What the people of Salem thought during this time was to first get revenge on the people that they disliked. Whether they were witches or not, people intended to target those that they did not get along with so that they could be arrested or even killed. Other than what historians speculate, they don't really have any written opinions of actual people during this time. In short words, it was complete chaos. It was one of those neighbor turning on neighbor situations with no probable cause. The court even accused Bridget Bishop's 4-year-old daughter Dorothy due to her timid confessions. But did she really confess if she was only 4 years old? The types of people that were accused were outspoken women, Quakers, due to the primary religion being Puritanism, and colonists with criminal backgrounds. What happened to the accused was that most people were accused of witchcraft actually died in prison. Others, including Bridget Bishop, died from hanging. It is a common belief that witches were burned at the stake. However, that only happened in the European witch trials. Many people believe that the Salem witch trials and European witch trials are related, but are in fact different. One form of torture that was documented was the case with the elderly Giles Corey. He was pressed to death on September 19, 1692, for refusing to go to trial and plead guilty or not guilty. Pressing is a brutal form of torture where the victim is stripped of his or her clothes, had a board put on his or her body, and then heavy rocks were slowly placed on the board. On April 19, 1692, he was examined and pleaded innocent. However, the judges didn't believe him, as the girls were moaning and groaning, and accusing him of torturing them with his specter. It was speculated that roughly 24 people had died. 19 people were executed, 1 was tortured, and the other 4 died in prison awaiting trial. It was recorded that between 140 and 150 people were arrested in the process of this witch hunt. Some of the people that were arrested were William Barker Sr., William Barker Jr., Sarah Bassett, Bridget Bishop, Sarah Churchill, Tituba, and Mary Toothaker. Found guilty and executed: Bridget Bishop, Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Reverend George Burroughs, and John Willard. Refused to enter a plea and tortured to death was only one, and that was Giles Corey. Found guilty and pardoned: Elizabeth Proctor, Elizabeth Johnson Jr., Sarah Wardwell, Dorcas Hoare, and Mary Post. Pled guilty and pardoned: Rebecca Eames, Abigail Hobbs, Mary Lacey Sr., and Mary Osgood. Died in prison: Sarah Osborne, Roger Toothaker, Anna Foster, and Lydia Dustin. Escaped from prison: John Alden Jr., Edward Bishop Jr., Sarah Bishop, Mary Bradbury, Philip English, Mary English, and Edward Farrington. Never indicted: Sarah Bassett, Mary Black, Elizabeth Hart, Sarah Cloyce, and William Hobbs. Those who evaded arrest were George Jacobs Jr. and Daniel Andrews. And other victims included were 2 dogs that were shot or killed after they were suspected of witchcraft. And now I have a video of the real history behind the Salem witch trials.
Why do you hurt these poor children?
I no hurt him at all.
What familiarity have you with the devil?
The Lord knows. I have not hurt them.
Are you an innocent person relating to this witchcraft?
I am innocent.
I'm a historian of American religious history, of Christianity primarily in America. I teach all of that in various ways, but for the most part I write about the 17th century here in New England and also in England. So I'm a transatlantic historian. Witchcraft, of course, goes back to Exodus. There's a sentence, "Don't let a witch live." And then in late medieval Europe, it was revived really as a major issue. It was an issue in ancient Israel as well, which is why it's in the Old Testament. So the colonists were being perfectly ordinary, doing the ordinary, usual thing when they had their inquiries about who was a witch and who was not. Witchcraft is primarily a legal process with a strong social base. So the social base is that in villages, towns, these are very small communities in early New England, people insult each other, and you insult them by calling that person a witch.
I came to Salem, and I spent just about 3 weeks here, and did a lot of research. And there were records, that you can only read in Salem. So there were records of what were called the examinations, which were the pre-trial hearings, which are very full. I mean, it's wonderful that we have all those records. The questions that are being asked by the magistrate and the answers that the witch suspects were giving, and they actually make very dramatic reading. The magistrate is pressing Sarah Good. He's saying over and over again, "Do you not afflict these children? You see how they are afflicted. Have you not seen the devil? Have you not made a pact with the devil?" And she kept saying, "No, no." Then he said, "How come these children are afflicted?" And she says, "There are others you brought here, too. Others are doing it." And you could just tell. I mean, she's grasping at straws. I mean, he will not believe her. So she tries to cast the blame on somebody else. But then she did herself no good by that, because the assumption would be if she knew who was afflicting the children, she must be a witch too.
To most of us, the least understandable aspect of it is that 50 or so people said in court that they were witches. We call them the confessing witches. We say, why would someone confess who had not actually signed the Devil's Compact? Because none of these people had literally signed the Devil's Compact. And the answer, the simplest answer would be has to be a psychological answer, that they had absorbed the message that they were sinners, tempted. Now, there's one other legal aspect of this. None of the confessing witches were executed. To prove to the court that you actually were a confessing witch is that you're asked to name others.
Well, the whole village had been fraught with dissension already, even before this happened. People were regarding each other with tremendous suspicion and enmity and fear, and thinking, that somebody they really disliked anyway might be a witch. Or even if they weren't, wouldn't it be good if they were named as a witch? Because that could lead to their destruction.
Spectral evidence came up in the sense that a woman or a man would testify to being tormented by someone whom no one else could see, and people could change form, or the devil could insert himself in people and make them do bizarre things, but not legally a significant role until Salem. And that, of course, is the Achilles heel of the whole Salem process, the use of spectral evidence.
It's fair to say all the girls, when it came to the examinations and trials, were shamming. They may have been genuinely hysterical before. They may have genuinely thought they were being bewitched before. But when it came to the examinations and trials, they were putting on a show that they knew they had to put on, because otherwise they might start being accused of being witches themselves. When it developed, it really was a political episode. I mean, the way it started wasn't, but when it went on, it continued because of village politics and town politics, and in the end, Massachusetts Bay politics. That's what drove the whole episode on.
Very early, there was the feeling that judicial errors were being made. But how hard it was to stop this thing, I mean, that was the problem. Who had the courage to stand up and say, this is really a train that's run off the tracks? October is the last session of the court, and then the governor of Massachusetts suspends the court because he's aware something is not going correct. And then in January, the remaining prisoners are let loose.
So it all, like, teetered to an end. I mean, there was no great statement from anybody saying this has all been the most dreadful mistake. We've executed 20 innocent people. What I hope people would learn is how witch hunts happen. We can learn to be aware if such a process seems to be starting in a community at any level. What it is about us that causes us to become fearful and suspicious and irrational in certain situations and end up causing terrible destruction.
So in Salem, rye was a huge staple crop back in the colonial times, and it was made to make bread and lots of other stuff, but there was a bunch of food poisoning going around in the summer of 1691, and that was also the time of when all these accusations started, and a bunch of people thought it was ergot, which is a fungus that actually attaches to itself to the rye. Now, consuming this would be similar to what the girls who got accused. It makes sense. So it causes muscle spasms, delusions, seizures, and contortions. And these were all supposedly signs of being a witch or like being possessed. And a bunch of these girls actually did live by the rye, so it made sense. And in 1962, when all these accusations actually stopped, it was a very dry summer, so not that much rye grew, and the ergot wasn't actually growing as much either, so the execution stopped, and then a bunch of people just stopped freaking out and acting like witches. So once they look back on it, was it a coincidence? Nobody really knew, but that's how that came into play. So during this whole witch trial thing, to see if the people were actually witches, they'd have a bunch of these tests conducted. And one of these tests was the swimming test. And what it was is the women who were accused, they'd get wrapped up, stripped, and then tossed into like a river or a stream or just any body of water. And then they'd have a rope tied around their waists. And if they weren't a witch, so the normal people, they'd grab the rope and get themselves back up, but it didn't really make any sense because they were tied up. So these people didn't really think anything through. But if they were witches, the witches would use their magical powers or whatever, and they'd float because they rejected the idea of baptism, because the water's signifying Jesus and it's holy and everything. So you'd pretty much die either way, because I mean you're gonna drown if they throw you in water and you're tied up. So it pretty much shows how dumb how all these people were. But yeah, there's not really a good way of getting out of it. So another test was actually based off of reciting a passage from the Bible, absolutely perfect. And if they messed up, they were actually accused of being a witch. It doesn't matter if they were nervous, if they were just coughing or sniffling. It doesn't matter whatsoever. And this was actually usually done in a courtroom when they were on trial. So they were pretty much set up to failure at this point. But an example of this is it was applied in the case of Jane Wenham. And she was accused of being a witch because she struggled to say, "Forgive us our trespasses and lead us into temptation." So she struggled to say it just like I did there. And she was actually accused of being a witch. So another example of this would be George Burroughs. He actually recited it perfectly before he got executed, and the people there didn't care. They just said it was the devil's trick. So there's pretty much no way getting out of this one either. So this test is really messed up, honestly. So the witch hunters would actually take the witch's urine and mix it with rye meal and ashes and make it into cake. Now, they fed this cake to a dog, and the dog was believed to be associated with the devil. So if the dog acted weird, they said the dog would actually point out who the witch would be, and then they would say their name, and then the witch would be accused of being a witch. And for example of this is Tituba. They made Tituba make a cake, and she was that black slave that the girls dance around with in the forest. But anyway, the cake didn't work, obviously, but Tituba still got accused because she had knowledge of spells and making this cake. So that was used against her in trial in the end, even though it didn't work. But this one consisted of having the witches strip in public, and any blemish they had, doesn't matter what it was, could be a mole, scar, a zit, a birthmark, whatever, would be called the devil's mark, and they got it from the devil. Now, supposedly numb could change color and shape. Everybody just making everything up just so they could get somebody to accuse. Even villagers would cut or burn other villagers so they wouldn't get convicted. That's how freaked out everybody was about this. And it's pretty much everybody's just pointing fingers at each other. And for this one, you almost never got out with being convicted. In the touch test, the women who were accused of being a witch would touch their possessed victims, and if the victims moved or had any response at all, then the accused would be witches. But if they didn't move, then the witch wasn't a witch. So in 1662, two elderly women were charged of bewitching and possessing two younger girls. And these girls had their fists clenched so hard that they had men try to go and unpry their hands, and it just didn't work. But when these two old ladies, Rose and Amy, touched them, they'd unclench their fists. So they went into a courtroom in an actual trial, and they blindfolded these two little girls. And then these little girls, they actually opened their fists for some random people. So it proves that Amy and Rose weren't actually witches, but they got hanged anyways. The incantations test was also known as charging, and it pretty much just forced the witch to order the devil out of their possessed victims. And this was used in the Alice Samuel trial, and it consisted of her husband and her daughter, and that family was accused of bewitching 5 girls from a Throckmorton family. They're all pretty wealthy. And then the judges forced the Samuels to release the girls, and then the girls were immediately back to normal. So after this happened, the Samuels were eventually hanged. So in the last test, which would be the pricking and scratching test, witch hunters would actually prick at the witch's marks. And in witch hunting books, it stated that the marks were insensitive to pain. So a lot of the times, what people would do is they'd use dull needles onto whoever they were pricking at, so they couldn't feel the pain or bleed, which would set them up to thinking that they're a witch. Now, a lot of people believe that the possessed people would find relief by scratching the witch until they drew blood. So if their skin healed over time, that would make them a witch, but anybody's skin would heal, so they're pretty much setting them up for failure again.
The Salem witch trials came to an end in May 1693. Those who were convicted as witches were thrown into prison, where they would have to pay to get released, while also paying for food and lodging. During this time, there was a big decline in the economy due to the distractions of the witch trials. The government took away their homes while imprisoned, along with everything else that they owned. Out of the 53 people tried for witchcraft, only 3 individuals were found guilty. By the end of the trials, some high-end citizens were accused of witchcraft, including the governor's wife. Many years later, the girls who started the hysteria, along with many of the accusers, asked for forgiveness and regret their actions. The Salem witch trials had a lasting effect on the world that still exists to this day. One effect that the trials left on the town and world was the continuation of witch hunts. People were still skeptical about witchcraft and if it could happen again. Another effect was the damage to the local people themselves. Hundreds of men and women were killed and imprisoned, leaving the population a lot lower than it was before the witch trials started, which really hurt the economy. The current justice system is organised and fair, all because of the witch trials. Today, those accused or convicted had the opportunity to choose their own lawyer to represent them. There is no religion or racism in the courtroom, and everyone has the freedom of speech. During the witch trial era, none of this was available. They had very little in terms of rights, and if it wasn't for the events of 1692, none of this would be available in today's court system. The trials opened the door to fairness and rights in the modern justice system.